I'm Mike Farrington, welcome back to my shop. I'm excited to introduce to you the double taper sanding disc. This gizmo, when combined with your table saw, will improve, dare I say, revolutionize your woodworking. What does it do? This disc will beautifully finish sand the edge of a workpiece to a perfect 90 degrees. So what is it? It's a precision machined aircraft grade, maybe even spacecraft grade, aluminum disc that has tapers on both sides, and I'll explain why that's important later in the video. So what are some of the uses? Well, it'll remove the marks left behind by a table saw, bandsaw, joiner, or planer, and it will leave a surface that's ready for finish. This is also awesome for glue-ups, such as wide panel glue-ups, tabletops, cutting boards, and so forth. Because the surface left behind is so smooth, parts can mate together as close to perfect as possible, which will reduce the overall appearance of glue lines. This is also great for sanding the inside edges of door or face frame parts prior to assembly. This inside corner is essentially impossible to sand properly once everything's put together. Doing it ahead of time ensures a professional result, and this joint will actually come together better if this surface is at a crisp 90 degrees. I also use it to sand the outside edges of doors, both long grain and end grain, and if there's a small amount of resizing to do, I'll do that as well. If you've ever painted the edges of MDF, you know it can be a challenge to get a good result. This disc makes quick work of that task. Sand the edge of your workpiece with the disc, apply 2 coats of a non-water-based primer, then a quick hand sanding, and then it's ready for paint. The results will be awesome. To sum up, this disc can finish sand the edges of parts professionally, consistently, and efficiently. If this sounds like something you'd like to have for your shop, I'll have the discs as well as the sandpaper for sale on my wonderful website. Head on over to mikefarrington.com for more information. If you've watched at least a couple of my YouTube videos, you've probably seen me using a similar disc with sandpaper attached to one side. My design with tapers on both sides allows a different grit to be attached to each side. This means changing grits is simply flipping the disc around in the table saw versus having to peel off and reapply a different grit. This also allows the advantage of using all of the sandpaper until it is dull, as opposed to peeling off and applying a new disc anytime I want to change grits. The second part of this video is going to go over the process of setting up and using the double tapered sanding disc. I'll also throw in a couple of pro tips along the way to spice things up. So let's get started. First things first, this disc can be used on any table saw that has a tilting arbor and the arbor's 5/8 of an inch. If you have a different arbor configuration, email me. The disc will also work with saw stop table saws, but the sensor needs to be deactivated. For the disc to function, the arbor needs to tilt 2 degrees towards the rip fence. If you have a right tilt saw, you're in luck. Install the disc, adjust the arbor, and get to work. If you have a left tilt saw where the blade tilts away from the fence, there are 2 solutions. The first and easiest is to simply set the fence on the other side of the blade, adjust the arbor, and get to work. I personally found that a little awkward. So what I ended up doing was I adjusted the 90-degree stop in my saw so that the saw could travel up 2 vertical and then over 2 more degrees towards the fence. This works perfect. The saw works as normal. The downside is I no longer have a 90-degree stop in my saw. However, I never found them to be reliable enough to be trustworthy. So I always got in the habit of using an engineer square to set 90 degrees anytime I needed to make an adjustment. Speaking of engineer squares, that's where setup begins. After installing the disc in your table saw, position an engineer square next to the disc and adjust the arbor until the disc is at 90 degrees. You're now ready to get to work. I keep describing the disc as having a taper. I think technically speaking it's cone-shaped. And this cone-like or conical-shaped concept is super duper uber important to understand. It's why this disc works so well and why a flat sanding disc does not work. And you know it's important when I break out my drawing skills to help demonstrate it. The taper or conical shape creates a wider opening at the front of the disc as the workpiece is entering the cut. As the workpiece is fed into the cut farther, the gap between the sanding disc and the fence becomes narrower until the center point of the disc, which conveniently was adjusted to 90 degrees during setup. After the workpiece has gone past the center point, the space between the fence and the disc becomes wider again, which is great because it reduces the chances of kickback. And this area here is where the material removal is taking place. After the workpiece is pushed past the disc, it's left with a beautifully sanded 90-degree edge. Here's a demonstration of this concept in the real world. Time for a pro tip. Use the 2-degree bevel to your advantage. For example, I'll install the disc with my arbor set at 90 degrees and use the 2-degree angle to add a back bevel to doors for opening and closing clearance. To this point, everything I've mentioned has been geared towards workpieces requiring a 90-degree edge. Keep in mind that this is not the only angle at which this disc can sand. Any angle your saw can adjust to can be sanded. So how much material can be removed in one pass? I typically shoot for between a 64th of an inch and a 32nd of an inch. Much more than that will tend to generate too much heat, which reduces the life of the sandpaper. That amount of material removal is perfect to eliminate machine tool marks. Pro tip, raise and lower the height of the disc in your table saw to better utilize all of the grit of each sanding disc. Along with the discs, I'll be selling 2 grits of sandpaper, 80 grit and 120. Now it might sound like those grits aren't fine enough to leave a nice finished surface, but remember how fast the disc is spinning. Essentially what's happening is the little particles of sand are going by the workpiece so quickly that they don't really have time to dig in. What this means is that the surface left behind by each of the 2 grits is finer than the number might indicate. The 80 grit discs leave a surface that's closer to 100 or 120 grit. The 120 grit discs leave a surface closer to 150 or 180 grit. Why 80 and 120 grit? Well, after some experimentation, I found that the 80 grit is great for situations where more material needs to be removed for painted projects and for prepping the edges of boards for glue-ups. The 120 grit disc is great for projects requiring a clear coat or stain. I can sand the edge of a part with the 120 grit disc and go directly to clear coat with no further prep, and it looks great. Stain grade projects are a little different. Again, hit the edge with a 120 grit disc, and then I come back and do a quick hand sanding with whatever grit I'm sanding the rest of the project to. I do this to ensure there's a consistent scratch pattern so that stain is absorbed as evenly as possible. In the future, I plan to add 150 and 180 grit discs to the lineup as well for those requiring a finer finished edge. I decided to start with 80 and 120 because in my opinion, those are the most useful. I've sourced the best sandpaper available. I went with such a high quality paper for one reason. It's spinning pretty quickly in a table saw, and I wanted to make sure that the adhesive holding the paper onto the disc was up to the challenge. I also wanted to make sure that the little bits of sand attached to the paper would have a good service life. As such, this paper lasts a very, very long time. I can push hundreds of feet by this disc and the paper is not dull. Typically, I can get 5 or 6 big projects out of a disc before it needs to be replaced. This is a time lapse of me sanding about 320 linear feet off the edge of this board. Looking at the sandpaper afterwards, there's some pitch buildup, but the sandpaper is still sharp with plenty of life left. One final word on sandpaper. When the paper is totally worn down and it's time for a replacement, peel the disc off, which won't be easy, and thoroughly clean the surface. Some amount of glue will remain on the disc. That needs to be completely cleaned off. I like to use acetone or goof off, but I'm sure there are a bunch of other cleaners that would work great. Just make sure that they don't leave a residue that would prevent the next disc from sticking properly. I like to put the disc in a 5-gallon bucket, splash it with whatever cleaner I'm going to use, let it soak for 5 or 10 minutes. This makes cleaning off any leftover adhesive really easy. Next up, I'd like to talk about sleds, miter gauges, and splitters. If you're going to sand the end of a tall or narrow workpiece, like a tall, narrow cabinet door, I think it's a good idea to use a sled or a miter gauge to guide the workpiece past the disc. This is going to increase safety, and it's going to help ensure consistent results. Also, if you like, you can attach a block of wood on the outfeed side of the throat plate of your table saw to help hold the workpiece against the rip fence. This will greatly reduce the chances of kickback. So that's it. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section below or send me an email. If you'd like to pick up a disc for yourself, have a look at my website. There'll be links in the video description below. Thanks for watching.